Good morning, friends. Welcome back to Feni for the Soul for one of our interesting interviews. Today we have, I'm very happy to introduce the 93 years old, 93 years young ambassador, Eric Gonsalves, to all of you. He's there on the screen. And good morning, Uncle Eric, as I would like to call him. And so Ambassador Gonsalves was with the Indian Foreign Service, the batch of 1950. He served the country very, very well for a whole 36 years in New Delhi and across the globe. He was ambassador of India to Japan, also to Belgium and the European Economic Community, which is the forerunner of the EU as we know of it today. I would also at this juncture like to thank the Indian Council of World Affairs, New Delhi, for a very substantial interview that Ambassador Kishan Rana conducted with Ambassador Gonsalves. It's 128 pages long, and it helped me with my own homework. So, I would like to greet Uncle Eric again. I like to call him Uncle Eric because I'm happy to know his son Peter and daughter-in-law Camille, who live in Bengaluru. So, Uncle Eric, how is the weather in Bengaluru today?
Well, the weather, it's quite pleasant. I mean, it's still under 35, a little muggy and thundery, but pleasant. No, it's enjoyable. The weather in Bangalore is pretty well enjoyable most of the year. Thank you.
And it seems the birds are also cooing in your garden.
Yes, well, we have I'm sorry, you can't see it because of the curtains, but there is a big, very the park of a hotel outside my window. And the birds, now there are not many, but when they start in the morning and in the evening, they're quite a sort of chorus or a duet or whatever going on.
Fantastic. So Uncle Eric, I'm going to show a visual first and then ask you the question as we had discussed. Let me show you the visual. So here we have Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, India's first Prime Minister, with the little children in New Delhi on November the 14th, which is Bal Din. And, he was always, had a smiling personality, and he loved children. We all know that. We grew up with those stories. So I am going to come, Uncle Eric, to a question very, very quickly. When you were about in your early 20s, 24 years old, you were a young officer in the Ministry of External Affairs. And there was this anecdote where Pandit Nehru actually walked you to the landing of his house after an official luncheon, official lunch meeting. So, that was such a nice gesture from a giant of a politician and a leader. So tell us more about this charismatic first Prime Minister of India.
That he was very natural and very affable. I mean, as you see in that picture with the kids, this was, in fact, that lunch was a very disastrous lunch in some ways, because Pandit Nehru that day was he was thinking of something. And so he was not really taking part in the conversation. The other guests were Krishnaman, who just come off the plane. So Indira Gandhi and I had to sort of make these two ambassadors happy all through the lunch almost, with Nehru commenting for a few times on what we did. But then I think he solved his problem at the end of the lunch. And so when it was finished and I went to say goodbye and thank you, he put his arm on my shoulders and took me to the landing so that I could then after go straight down to to my car. But that was the one and only really personal thing that ever happened between us. I met him frequently in meetings, but you will realize that I was a very junior officer. And I mean, he died before I even came back to the ministry in a substantive capacity. But he was one of our great leaders, statesmen, and what have you. And I don't think that we can ever pay enough tribute to him. I mean, he was not perfect, of course. I mean, even in his foreign policy, I mean, some of us would say that he was naive here, he was naive there. But he did the best he could. He always consulted. He was most affable, and I mean, he would flare up, but then he would subside. No, he was a great person to work with, and in fact, I'm glad the first few years of my life, I spent at least in that same quadrangle. We saw him every other day because he came in, he would come. I was then working for the Secretary General, N.R. Pillai. And every other day, Nehru would come charging something when he wants to ask some question. Or otherwise, a message would come, Panditji wants, so Pillai went right. So it was very informal and simple in those days, not all this bandobast we have now.
Fantastic. I believe that in the early years of the Ministry of External Affairs, because he was foreign minister also, he didn't mind, Pandit Nehru didn't mind even sharing the common toilet,
Well, we all had a common toilet. I mean, there were in fact two toilets on that part of the floor where where we worked. And occasionally, not very often, but at least, once in 2 or 3 months, you'd find yourself either you were walking in when he was using it or you were walking in when he was using it. So it was all very informal and simple and nobody bothered too much. No, there were, things like, my wife used to go there to collect a little later on after we got married for the Red Cross, for the soldiers, benevolent fund or something. And Panditji would stop, he would get out of the car, wait, feel in his pockets. 3 times out of 4, he had no money in his pockets. So some surprise, he had to go running upstairs to get 100 rupee note or 200. There were no 200 rupee notes in those days. I think 100 rupee note was the normal currency. He donated it happily and we went off. And so on, so on. It was, well, it was nice, pleasant, and very sort of soul warming. That's all I can say.
Wonderful. Uncle Eric, I'll move to the 1972 to 75 period when you were, Minister for Political Affairs in the Indian Embassy in Washington, D.C. And the Americans decided to write off their, $6 billion US, what is called the PL 480 funds, which was parked with the Reserve Bank of India. And you were instrumental in working on this, challenging assignment. So tell us all the intricacies and, why it was such a difficult assignment.
Well, it wasn't really difficult in that sense. I've had far more difficult assignments, but it was a bit complicated for the reason that, the Americans had enormous surplus of food grains. They used to give them, they used to sell them, give them away, donate them. In fact, Europe was fed by America for years. India was fed by America for at least decades. And in fact, we used to rely on the Americans. And if it was not used, probably it would have gone into the Gulf of Mexico, wherever it was. But since there was an accounting system for most of it, it wasn't given. It was theoretically paid for and went into a RBI account. And by about 1970, it had accumulated to $6 billion, which in those days was an enormous sum of money. It didn't make any sense, and people were toying around with the idea that it could be used for rural electrification and so on. But if we had tried to monetize that, I think the finances of the government of India would have gone bust. But this was a problem of how to go about getting the congressional approval, which was the only real problem. And there I must say that we really did not do the heavy lifting. The really heavy lifting was done by the American ambassador. Again, a great friend of India's, a man called Patrick Moynihan, who had come, sent by Nixon, in fact. And Moynihan really sort of, we used to have conferences at Dulles Airport or somewhere on the way, or lunch in a restaurant, and we would work out strategies, which people, which committee, which one. In fact, I learned the art of lobbying from Moynihan, how you got this through. This one, he said, this senator, don't go to him, try the chief of staff first, and then try the aide there, and so on, before, and soften him up and give him papers and send a gift or two, and so on and so on. So we worked on the Appropriations Committee and the Foreign Relations Committee, and we worked on all of these people. And I think in about, took us maybe a year of this lobbying and pushing, which we did, which again, India was not, we were against this thing. We thought it was indecent to lobby. Everybody has all sorts of European governments, everybody did. And we also had to learn, fortunately, we learned a little bit. And eventually, this is the, sometimes, there's a humorous bit in a way. when the final basic agreement was finished, we just had 6 points on one piece of paper, which I took with me, went with the ambassador, of course, came. And at that point, Kissinger had been appointed Secretary of State. He had before that been the National Security Advisor. So the first interview TN Call had with Kissinger was to hand over this agreement, which was agreed in principle and so on, but technically we were putting our proposal forward. I still remember the deputy secretary, deputy assistant secretary for South Asia saying, "But they'd not heard of it. I mean, in the State Department, it kept out of the thing until we got the basics through." So, and then again, I mean, this is illustrative bureaucracy. Main agreement done on a piece of paper, not even one size. When the final agreement was done later on, I mean, and signed by Moynihan and I think the finance minister or the finance secretary, I'm not sure, we got a book of about 600 or 700 pages with all the details and appendices. I've never read it. I never bothered to read it. But that's bureaucracy for you.
To your Japanese phase, 1975 to 78, when you were ambassador of India to Japan, which was a very important assignment. And you have quoted, Mr. Nakasone, who later became the Prime Minister of Japan. But when he was the chief of the LDP party, the powerful political party, Nakasone is supposed to have said that your Prime Minister, meaning referring to Mrs. Gandhi, wears trousers, while our Japanese ministers wear skirts, quote unquote. So that's a very interesting comment from political heavyweight from Japan. And you interacted with Nakasone quite a bit. So can you tell us about the kind of politician he was?
Well, Nakasone was he was again one of the outstanding prime ministers that Japan had. He was also quite strong nationalist, and clearly this whole restriction on the military side of Japanese affairs was galling to many people in Japan. They took it because that was the way the peace treaty had been made, and they had only self-defense forces and no nuclear stuff and so on. But they felt it really wasn't the way any great power should be made to behave. Sone, who gave us that thing that they were interested in other Asian, that they were not American stooges, that they had a place of their own. And now, of course, you see that this has now come to full fruition. I mean, after, of course, Nakasone and Koizumi and Abe, finally the present Prime Minister have now made us, we are now co-equals almost in the Quad thing, so that we are now really a part of Asia in more than economic terms, also in political and security terms.
True. Very interesting that, something like the seeds were sown by Prime Minister Nakasone, and it's, it's reached a level now where Indo-Japanese ties are very, very strong. Very interesting. I'll come to the 1977 period, when the Janata Party came to power under Morarji Desai. And, Atal Bihari Vajpayee was the foreign minister. And it was Mr. Vajpayee who, insisted on building bridges with China, a powerful neighbor like China. And I believe that you went on this, tour to China with Mr. Vajpayee. So can you tell us about his, kind of knowledge of foreign affairs and his skills as a politician?
Well, of course, Vajpayee was he was a long-term parliamentarian. I don't know how many years he spent in parliament, but he's been there. I mean, I remember being examined by him when he was chairman of the estimates committee when I was a deputy secretary. And what we are now talking about was when I was risen up to be secretary. No, Vajpayee knew foreign affairs. He studied it. He worked on it. So he was, and he also, it's not so much only foreign affairs, but I mean, he had a very clear notion of what the national interest should be. And because one of these was, in fact, where there was a complete coincidence between him and say people like even Nehru and Homi Bhabha and so on, that we should also have nuclear power and we should have nuclear weapons. Frankly, I mean, I think that they had also gone down that thing, taken a decision. When it was to be, I think we made a small mistake. We should have done it a little faster, but that's the part. Um, so, but when we went to China, I mean, at that time it had become clear that we had already decided to exchange ambassadors. Ambassadors had been exchanged after 62. And we were beginning to re-establish relations, and people were talking about, what these relations should be. And finally, I think that the then Foreign Secretary persuaded Mr. Vajpayee that he should return the visit, because the last visit from the Chinese had been Zhou Enlai, who had come to visit Nehru, I think in 60 or 62 or something like that. So that was agreed, and a certain amount of fair amount of preparation was done on both sides. I mean, and then we had a cultural delegation, and so at least we were prepared to talk in general terms about improving bilateral relations. And then at that point of time, the Chinese system also developed. A whole change started taking place, because first of all, Mao died, and Deng Xiaoping, who had been sort of relegated to the background, was about to make a comeback. He had not yet made a comeback. I think the former Secretary General was in charge, but it was evident that Deng was a coming man. And in fact, the main discussion was with Deng. And at that stage, I think, I mean, now in hindsight, we were not quite prepared, because we were still stuck in the rut, which we could not resolve from that parliamentary resolution that not one square inch of Indian soil would be surrendered to anybody. And so we really didn't make a brief which at least attempted to see whether a compromise was possible on the border dispute. We were willing to talk about all sorts of other relations. And some other thing did happen. I mean, the Kailash Mansarovar pilgrimages were restored. A whole lot of trade things were opened up. We began to take part in trade fairs. A whole lot of our businessmen started going off to the Guangzhou Fair and so on, later on to Kunming. So things began to open up. And as I say, pilgrims, as I say, went to Kailash the same next year. But border, we did not even think that we would discuss. The Chinese, of course, had of course taken a positive effect, and they de facto put forward the same proposition that Zhou Enlai had made to Nehru, which was the package which automatically said, I mean, what you have got in the east you keep, and what we have got in the west we keep, because that is where the road was built into Aksai Chin. And we had actually done no background thing. We just thought that we could just talk about it and then finally come later on to a compromise, if we would go to compromise at all. Whether we should do a compromise even was not yet been discussed in the government of India, and I don't think it's ever been discussed in the government of India. Although we have now, I mean, begun to realize de facto that line of action control is really all we are ever going to get. And that was something that, in a way, we had agreed much later on when Rajiv Gandhi went to Beijing. But when Vajpayee went, there was no way to go. Now, that was one. We had broken the first lot of ice with the Chinese. We didn't get very much further, but that at least was.
Yeah.
And Vajpayee, I must say, I mean, no, I think that, I mean, I've worked with 3, 4, 5, 6, I don't know, 6, 7 foreign ministers. I mean, putting Panditji aside, there are only 2 that I would say deserve, no, maybe 3, but basically 2. I mean, Narasimha Rao and Vajpayee, who were real foreign ministers in that they've made policy or tried to get policies through and relate our relations and the external patterns of India.
To show a video which I discussed with you of, Prime Minister Vajpayee going to China in 2003. It's an Associated Press AP video. I'll show it, and maybe you can comment on that, because it's a very.
Rajesh Vishwa and Sibal, and Mm.
मैं इस विश्वविद्यालय में भारत अध्ययन केंद्र का उद्घाटन करते हुए अपने को अत्यंत गौरवान्वित महसूस कर रहा हूँ। We should focus on the simple truth that there is no objective reason for discord between us, and neither of us is a threat to the other. These simple but profound principles should form the bedrock of the future India-China partnership. Both India and China were present at the broader dialogue of developing countries with the G8 countries in Evian earlier this month. I was struck by the congruence in our positions. If we acted in concert, it would be very difficult for the world to ignore us.
2003 visit was pretty fruitful, wasn't it? When he went.
Yeah. Well, in a sense, the partial breakthrough came when Rajiv Gandhi's visit. Vajpayee, in a sense, went there and clinched that thing. And this fairly sort of peaceful period on the border went on after that almost till Ladakh happened. I mean, we've had problems and little incidents, but nothing happened till Ladakh. That's the first time that it has changed, at least as far as the border is concerned. And otherwise, I mean, bilateral economic relations have, as you know, grown enormously.
Uncle, let me show a video. Huh? I'll show a video and then ask you the question.
Mr. President and Mrs. Reagan, to me, every journey is an adventure. And I can say that this one is an adventure in search of understanding and friendship. It is difficult to imagine two nations more different than ours. As history goes, your country is a young one. Over the years, it has held unparalleled attraction for the adventurous and daring, for the talented as well as for the persecuted. It has stood for opportunity and freedom. The endeavors of the early pioneers, the struggle for human values, the coming together of different races have enabled it to retain its elan and dynamism of youth. With leadership and high ideals, it has grown into a great power. Today, its role in world affairs is unmatched. Every word and action of the President is watched and weighed and has global repercussions. India is an ancient country and history weighs heavily on us. The character of its people is formed by the palimpsest of its varied experiences. The circumstances of its present development are shadowed by its years of colonialism and exploitation.
You know, Uncle Eric, this is from that Reagan library, you know, it's on the YouTube, and it's about, Mrs. Gandhi speaking at that 1982 reception that that President Reagan gave her, you know, when she on the state visit. Now, my question was that the entire 70s following the, Bangladesh war, the Americans had and then the emergency that followed. The Americans had cold-shouldered Indira Gandhi, and then she was not able to visit the US for a whole decade almost. And you were instrumental in the Ministry of External Affairs in networking with your American counterparts to get Mrs. Gandhi to go to the Cancun summit in 1981, followed by this state visit in 1982. So tell us what went into getting all that going, and how it was to work with Mrs. G, as you call her.
First thing that happened after Mrs. G came back in 1980 was that, as used to happen in those days, I don't know how it works now. When the new prime minister was after the new prime minister was sworn in, we got the usual thing saying that the Americans would like to send a special representative of the president, to meet with her and congratulate her. So we knew that this was the opening shots. And I still remember that meeting. The man who came was a man called Clark Clifford, one of Reagan's close buddies. And so Mrs. G made it quite clear that whatever had happened in the past, we were quite willing to relook at this whole relationship. And certainly we did not have any great animus as far as the Americans were concerned. Whereas we thought that our partnership with the Americans would be excellent for us in economic terms, in political terms, in technological terms, and all sorts of terms. And I think Clark Clifford took the message back, but it didn't quite, we were not quite sure, because the anti-Indian thing was a long-term thing. It was, I say, part of it was Cold War. Part of it was the Pakistani relationship with the Pentagon and the military forces in the United States. Part of it was our relationship with the Soviet Union. It was a complicated affair. Sort of to even contemplate change, we were not sure how it would come in America, and we didn't get any feel for quite a while until, as I said, this meeting in Cancun turned up, and then it was mentioned of an invitation to Mrs. G was heard. And strangely enough, again, one of my great buddies while I was in Washington was a man who had been deputy director of the CIA. And he was passing through, and we had corresponded, as I say, as people all after that. Once we got to know each other in Washington for the rest of our lives almost. And he sent me a message from Colombo saying that could he pass through Delhi and have a chat? I said, of course. I mean, delighted. Stay a day, 2 days, have lunch, take you around. But when he came, he said, and now do you think that the old girl will be anxious to go to Washington? I said, of course, like a shot. So that was how we, then of course it went through all the usual channels and the invitation came. But it was in fact almost at the end of my, I was in fact already getting ready to leave for Brussels. I mean, all of these things suddenly, I mean, my talks with the Chinese came about that time. I went with the PM to Melbourne, where we had a spat with the British about the Indian Ocean. But anyhow, I mean, at that point, I remember it was the day we were leaving Melbourne that the formal invitation of Cancun. So, you know, at least I'm closing my dealings with the Americans on a very high note.
Nice, nice. Wonderful. You know, President Jayawardene of Sri Lanka. This is from their Sunday Observer newspaper in Lanka, this photograph. So my question really, Uncle Eric, is that you know, in your long career, you had excellent rapport with many heads of states. And, you know, I believe that with President Jayawardene of Sri Lanka, you know, there was this anecdote where, you know, after one speech session that he gave, and then President Sanjeeva Reddy gave, you know, he actually offered you a glass of brandy. So I mean, that's fantastic rapport with the head of state, you know. So can you tell us about Mr. Jayawardene?
Jayawardene used to come to India at least every so often, private visit, public visit, whatever it was. And they were agitating that the President of India should also return those visits. And finally, with great difficulty, Sanjeeva Reddy, who of course was a hangover of the Janata group, when Mr. G had just been elected, agreed to go. And that was state visit, President of India. We didn't think too much about it because it was ceremonial, do all the courtesies and so on, handing over keys and speeches and university garlands and degrees and so on. So, in fact, I didn't even want to go on the visit. Mr. G said, no, the president thinks that you're neglecting him. So I went. so we landed up there, and well, it went off quite well. I mean, as I said, Jayawardene was an old buddy of Jayawardene from the old Congress days and so on. And finally came this banquet when Jayawardene threw away the speech his foreign ministry had given him and said, "I will speak from the heart," and gave. So naturally, I mean, Sanjeev Reddy had to do the same thing. So he also threw away his speech, and my mouth, because if he says something that reveals his old pre anti-Congress days, or because he was quite anti Mrs. G and so on. But no, I mean, he that way he behaved quite perfectly. His speech was totally innocuous. And so I thought, when the dinner was over, and in fact that was the end of the visit also, because we were leaving the next day. So I visibly relaxed, and I was looking around because dinner itself was dry, but there was a special thing that they would serve liqueurs after dinner. So I'm looking around for some sustenance, and then Jayawardene comes up, puts his arm around me. I said, why were you looking so worried, Eric? I didn't think that you'd be worried about my speech. I wasn't worried about his speech at all. When my presidency, anyway, my head was being chopped off when I went back. I said, not work. Anyway, that is one of the problems we have in the diplomatic service, and I think you should leave it like that. Oh, I mean, all well is well.
Wonderful. So he actually offered you a glass of.
Yes, he summoned a guy, and they poured out double tot of brandy, and I toasted him. In fact, when I went back later, and he was the ex-president and so on, he gave a dinner, or he got a secretary to give a dinner, just the six of us, because his wife and my wife also got along quite well. Patient man, so you couldn't, you had to be persuaded sometimes. And at least on one occasion, when we had the official meeting, turned me down flat. I didn't know what to do, because this was I don't even remember what the issue was. I think it was about the taking back of, closing down this whole idea of repatriating Indian citizens, to which I got an agreement from the Sri Lankan bureaucracy. But yes, then when I was going to have dinner in the High Commissioner's house, got a message saying the president would like to see you at his private residence. In those days, they were very careful. He didn't do any business. He had a private house. So when we went there, he opened a very rare bottle of Santori whiskey, and then he very skillfully backtracked and agreed to what I said, what he had not agreed to in the office. So, I mean, he thanked God and so on. Then he told me old stories about how his first drink, how his father chased him around house with a whip for ruining his first good bottle of brandy and so on.
So finally, the last question, Uncle Eric, and that is, you've been watching the Indian foreign policy closely, because you spent a whole career in that, field. So do you think we as a nation have become smarter and more effective in international diplomacy now in 2021 from what we were, let us say, many years ago?
Very different world in which even power itself has shifted. The great power, which on either side is the Atlantic. Only the Americans are left, and even the Americans are not what they were. Asia is becoming much more important. But even other than that, the subjects of international relations have changed so much. You just cannot believe. In the old days, trade was important, but nobody really bothered that much about trade. It was, and some companies dealt with it inside. But now, with supply chains and multinationals and these great big, this whole new world of artificial intelligence and these various, mainly American, I don't know, whatever you call them, the Facebook and Google and so on. The domination they have, in which certain Chinese are beginning to follow, like Huawei and what have you. It's a totally different world. Where the interchange, globalization has changed it, the supply chains have changed it. And it's really becoming impossible to live in this setup if you are not one rooted in your own bailiwick, so to speak. And that is one problem we have. We have still not quite settled down in South Asia. We still have a bust up with the Pakistanis. But other than that, I think that on the whole, what we've done in around us, that deserves in the Indian Ocean and in ASEAN and so on is very considerable, and that I think is worth commending. But I do think that we have not yet been able to convert the main people who are needed to carry this further forward, which is the the whole entrepreneurs and businessmen and so on. Because without a projection of economic and other technological power and so on, we are not going to be available. And our GDP is now going to be number 3, or I mean maybe 4 or 5 somewhere, but we will be the third power if we play it right after America and China. So we now, I think, have to, and we've got to understand also that a lot of this is going to be done in Asia, not in the Pacific. There, of course, we are beginning to understand that. And we've done also a little good bit of work out into the Arab world, but the Arab world is fickle, and also their staying power is limited because they're only capable really of living on their oil riches. The oil riches are going to disappear when this climate thing sort of gets rid of fossil fuel. So whether that's any good, I don't know. But what this whole great consolidation of industrialization and economic efforts, all the way from Korea and Japan down through Southeast Asia, up to at least the Gulf and Iran. This is something where, and the Indian Ocean, a certain amount of Africa there, where we have to be able to be a fairly important thing. This is something we will have to, we made a beginning, but I don't think adequately. And I think we look too far away at just the old white powers. Americans, Europeans, Russians, should keep them in. By all means, the Americans certainly, Russians probably, the Europeans up to a point. But we've got to work a lot harder in Asia. And we've got BIMSTEC, we've done this and that. But you see, the main thing that is working used to be APEC. Now, in a sense, that has become RCEP. And RCEP is going to be the backbone of Asian solidarity or non-Asian solidarity, but certainly the projection of Asia as an economic power. And if we are not in that, I mean, we're not going to. So we've got to eat, we've got to work on that and bite the bullet, so to speak. Otherwise, we may not even stay number 3. We may start going down. We've got to think about this. I mean, the prospects are considerable. The challenges are great. The results could be very greater, but we've got to play ball. And if what we've done with the damn pandemic, going and wasting our time with rallies and trying to beat up Mrs. Mamata Banerjee, or panchayat elections in UP and so on, this is not going to get us to great power status for sure.
Thank you, Uncle Eric, for this wonderful, discussion and interview. So, all the best to you, and I hope to see you when I come to Bengaluru next. Yeah.
Sure.
Bye.